The air in the archive was a manufactured thing, scrubbed of life. It tasted of chilled metal and the faint, sterile tang of ozone from the server cores that hummed in their silent, monolithic rows. Elian breathed it in, a shallow, disciplined breath, just as he had every day for the last 7 years. The air was a constant, a known variable in an equation he had painstakingly balanced to ensure his own survival. He was a part of the machine, a quiet cog, his movements precise and economical as he navigated the narrow corridors between humming data stacks. His uniform, a crisp slate-gray synthetic fabric, was perfectly pressed, a shield of anonymity. His face, reflected in the polished chrome surfaces, was a mask of placid neutrality. No one looked at him twice. He was Unit 734, Data Archivist, Grade 3rd. Efficient, reliable, invisible. This was the life he had built from the ashes of another, a life predicated on a single, vital deception. Underneath the uniform, taped to the pale skin of his abdomen, was the patch, the suppressant. It leached a steady, clinical cocktail into his bloodstream, muting the parts of his biology that the consortium had deemed a liability, a chaotic variable in their equation of perfect order. It stripped him of scent, of cycle, of the very essence that had once defined him as something other than a neutered, functional beta. It made him safe. It made him empty. The emptiness was a cold, familiar companion, a void he had learned to inhabit. It was better than the alternative. He remembered the alternative in fractured sensory bursts, the cloying sweetness of the reconditioning center's air scrubbers, the weight of judgmental eyes, the shame that felt like a physical sickness. He remembered the scent of his own fear, so he welcomed the void. He embraced the sterile hum of the archive, the cool, logical flow of data streams he curated. The data was clean, predictable. It had rules. It made sense. His focus was absolute, his fingers flying across the holographic interface of a terminal, cataloging and cross-referencing corrupted fragments from a derelict pre-consortium satellite. The task required immense concentration, a deep dive into layers of decaying code. It was the kind of work that allowed him to forget the patch on his skin, to forget the faint, phantom ache in his bones that never truly went away. He was so immersed, he didn't register the subtle shift in the environment at first. The constant, low-frequency hum of the server cores faltered, dipping in pitch for a microsecond. A flicker in the recessed lighting strips overhead, a brief, nauseating dip into twilight before the emergency generators kicked in with a seamless thrum. A system cascade. Minor likely, but enough to trigger a localized alert. His terminal flashed a crimson warning. Data integrity compromised. Protocol 7. He felt a familiar, unwelcome spike of adrenaline, a cold needle prick in his gut. Protocol 7 meant a manual lockdown and a data purge of the affected sector. It meant the director would be notified. Director Valerius Thorn. The name itself felt like a drop in temperature. Director Thorn was the architect of this sterile world, the absolute authority within the Central Archive Division. He was a man spoken of in hushed, reverent tones, an alpha of unparalleled control and intellect, a walking embodiment of the consortium's highest ideals. He moved through the world with a chilling, frictionless grace, his presence a silent pressure that demanded perfection. Elian had only ever seen him from a distance, a tall, severe figure in a perfectly tailored black uniform, his silver blonde hair catching the cold light. He never raised his voice. He never had to. His gaze was enough to strip a subordinate down to their component parts, analyze them for flaws, and discard them if found wanting. A wave of dizziness washed over Elian, sudden and intense. The air, once so familiar, suddenly felt thick, suffocating. The suppressant patch on his skin began to burn, not a gentle warmth, but a sharp, acidic fire. He pressed a hand to his stomach, a tremor running through his fingers. It had never done this before. The patch was a marvel of bioengineering, designed for flawless, uninterrupted function for its prescribed 30-day cycle. He had just applied a new one this morning. It could not be failing. It was impossible. He swallowed, his throat dry, the taste of ozone now acrid on his tongue. The crimson light from his terminal pulsed, bathing his pale face in a hellish glow. The burning intensified, a white-hot point of failure radiating outwards through his nerves. A cold sweat broke across his forehead. His own body felt alien to him, a system in revolt. The void inside him, the carefully maintained emptiness, was being flooded. Something was rising, a tide of sensation he hadn't felt in years, raw and terrifyingly organic. It was a scent, his scent. He could smell it himself, a ghost on the air, faint at first, then rapidly strengthening. Rain-soaked earth after a long drought, crushed green herbs, a wild, untamed fragrance that had no place in this sterile, metallic world. It was the smell of everything the consortium sought to eradicate. It was the smell of an Omega. Panic seized him, a brutal physical thing that stole his breath and sent black spots dancing in his vision. He fumbled with the clasp on his uniform, his fingers numb and clumsy, needing to get to the patch, to rip it off, to do something, anything. But it was too late. The delicate balance of his life had shattered. The equation was broken. A shadow fell over his terminal. Elian froze, his blood turning to ice. He didn't have to look up to know who it was. The air had changed again, charged with a new pressure, a presence so absolute it seemed to absorb the very light and sound around it. The faint scent of ozone was sharper now, laced with something else, something cold and clean and utterly dominant. The scent of a pure-blooded alpha. Director Valerius Thorn stood behind him, his form a perfect, dark silhouette against the pulsing red light. He had not made a sound. Elian remained perfectly still, his head bowed, his entire being clenched in a rictus of terror. He could feel the director's gaze on the back of his neck, analytical and piercing. The silence stretched, thin and fragile, threatening to snap. It was a silence filled with the hum of the servers, the frantic beat of Elian's own heart, and the horrifying, undeniable fragrance of his own exposed nature, blooming in the sterile air like a defiant, fatal weed. Then the director spoke, his voice a low, measured baritone that cut through the humming tension. "Archivist," he said, the single word devoid of any discernible emotion. "Report the anomaly." Valerius Thorn processed the world through a lens of filtered, quantifiable data. Emotion was a corrupting influence, a chaotic variable that led to inefficiency and error. His own biology, the primal instinct of his alpha designation, was a system to be managed, disciplined, and controlled with the same ruthless precision he applied to the archive's data streams. He had spent his entire life mastering this control, honing his mind and body into a perfect instrument of the consortium's will. His personal space was an extension of this philosophy, minimalist, sterile, the air recycled to a clinical purity. There were no personal effects in his office, only the clean lines of his desk, the silent glow of his command interface, and the vast panoramic window that overlooked the ordered grid of the city below. Everything in its place, everything functioning according to its design. The system cascade in Sector Gamma 7 was a minor irritation, a predictable consequence of integrating decaying pre-consortium hardware. He had descended to the archive floor to oversee the purge protocol personally, not out of necessity, but out of a deep-seated intolerance for disorder. He moved through the corridors with an economy of motion that was second nature, his presence silencing the low murmur of activity as he passed. The subordinates, all designated betas, would avert their eyes, their posture stiffening with a mixture of fear and respect. It was the expected, correct response to his authority. He was approaching the locus of the corruption when he first detected the foreign data point. It was not on his interface. It was in the air. A scent. The initial input was so alien, so completely outside the established parameters of his environment that his mind struggled to categorize it. It was not the smell of overheating circuits or burnt wiring. It was not a chemical leak. It was organic, unfiltered, a complex layered fragrance that bypassed his intellectual analysis and struck something deeper, something dormant and visceral. Rain, soil, wild, unfamiliar vegetation. It was an impossible scent for this place, a ghost of a world that no longer existed within these climate-controlled walls. His steps slowed. The scent grew stronger, a clear signal originating from the terminal glowing with the crimson alert. And there, bathed in the red light, sat one of his archivists. Unit 734. Elian. Valerius had his entire staff's psychometric and biological profiles memorized. Unit 734 was listed as a beta, grade C. High aptitude for pattern recognition, low social integration, stable, unremarkable, a perfect cog. But the data flooding Valerius's senses now was a violent contradiction to that profile. This was not the scent of a beta. This was the raw, potent scent of an omega, an unsuppressed omega. The revelation did not spark anger or alarm. Instead, a profound, cold stillness settled over him. It was the same mental state he entered when faced with a critical system breach. Isolate the anomaly, analyze the threat, contain the variable. He approached the archivist's workstation in complete silence. The man, the Omega, was frozen, his posture rigid with terror. The scent pouring off him was thick with it now, a sharp, metallic tang of fear layered over the deeper, earthier notes. It was an astonishingly potent signal, and it triggered a cascade of its own within Valerius's disciplined biology. A low, predatory hum started deep in his chest. The air suddenly seemed thin, and he was aware of the beat of his own heart, a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. His instincts, so long suppressed and sublimated into ambition and control, were stirring. They recognized this scent. They responded to it with a clarity that was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. He was the only alpha on this floor, the only one who could possibly perceive this. The betas around them would smell nothing but the usual sterile air. This was a private, silent crisis unfolding in their midst. The Omega was a security risk of the highest magnitude, a biological time bomb in the heart of the consortium's most sensitive data hub. The protocol was clear. He was to be detained, handed over to the compliance division, and processed. He would be sent to a reconditioning center, or more likely, decommissioned. It was the logical, efficient solution. Valerius stood behind the trembling figure, observing the fine tremor in the man's hands, the rigid line of his shoulders. The scent was a physical presence now, wrapping around him, sinking into the fibers of his uniform. It was a chaotic, beautiful, dangerous thing. He registered the Omega's distress, the sheer panic radiating from him, as another data point. And then he made a decision. It was a decision that ran contrary to decades of training, to the core tenets of his own philosophy. It was illogical. It was inefficient. It was a risk. But the anomaly was too unique, too interesting, to simply hand over to the blunt instrument of the compliance division. He wanted to study it. He wanted to understand the breakdown in the system that had allowed this to happen. He wanted, on a level he refused to yet analyze, to contain it for himself. He watched the Omega for another long moment, his mind calculating variables, running threat assessments, plotting a new course of action. The primal part of him was sated by the proximity, by the scent of fear and submission. The disciplined part of him was already formulating a plan. "Archivist," he said, his voice perfectly level, cutting through the tension. "Report the anomaly." The Omega flinched, as if struck. He did not turn. His voice, when it came, was a choked whisper, barely audible over the hum of the servers. "Data corruption. Sector Gamma 7 Director, initiating purge protocol." Valerius's eyes narrowed slightly. The archivist was attempting to deflect, to pretend. A foolish, desperate gambit. "I am not referring to the data, archivist," Valerius stated, his tone dropping half a degree, the coldness in it now unmistakable. He took a single step closer, invading the man's personal space. The scent of Omega, of Elion, was intoxicatingly strong. "I am referring to the unscheduled biological event." Report. Elion's world had compressed to a single point of unbearable pressure, the space between his own rigid body and the looming presence of Director Thorn. The director's voice was a physical force, vibrating through the air, through the floor, through the very bones of his skull. It was a voice that expected and received absolute obedience. There was no escape. The lie he had tried to offer, the pathetic attempt to hide behind protocol, had dissolved against the cold wall of the director's perception. He knew. Of course he knew. The scent was a confession, a scream in the silent room. Elion forced his muscles to unlock, to turn slowly in his chair. He kept his eyes downcast, fixed on the polished black tips of the director's boots. To meet his gaze felt like an act of suicidal defiance. The air was thick with their mingled scents, a war of opposing forces. His own, wild and earthy and laced with terror, and the director's, a clean, sharp scent of ozone and cold metal, the smell of absolute sterile authority. It was overwhelming, a sensory assault that made his head spin. His reawakened Omega biology was reacting, recognizing the Alpha's dominance on a cellular level, screaming at him to submit, to make himself small, to placate the predator. "Director," he managed to say, his voice a ragged edge of sound. "There has been a malfunction. My medical equipment." It was the only explanation he could offer, a half-truth that sounded flimsy even to his own ears. He risked a glance upward, just a flicker, and immediately regretted it. Director Thorn's eyes were the color of a winter sky, a pale, piercing gray that seemed to see everything. There was no anger in them, no disgust. There was only an intense, unnerving focus, like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. It was somehow worse than rage. It was dehumanizing. "A malfunction," Director Thorn repeated, the words flat and devoid of inflection. He did not move, did not react. He simply stood there, a monolith of calm control, while Elian's world crumbled. The silence stretched again, each second a fresh torment. Elian could feel the stares of his co-workers, the betas who could not smell what was happening but could sense the shift in power, the dangerous energy emanating from the director. They were pretending to work, their heads bent over their terminals, but he knew they were listening, watching from the corners of their eyes. He was exposed. He was finished. His career, his manufactured life, his very existence were forfeit. He braced himself for the inevitable command. Security. He waited for the heavy hands to fall on his shoulders, to be dragged away to the sterile oblivion of the compliance division. Instead, the director said, "My office now." The walk to the director's office was the longest of Elian's life. He moved on numb, unsteady legs, his gaze locked on the broad, black-clad back in front of him. Director Thorne walked at a measured pace, not looking back, confident that Elian would follow. The corridor seemed to stretch into infinity, the cool, recycled air doing nothing to quell the fire in Elian's veins. With every step, he felt more exposed, his scent a trail of breadcrumbs leading him to his own execution. The director's office was on the top floor, a place of myth and fear among the lower-level staff. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a space that was just as Elian had imagined, vast, minimalist, and cold. One entire wall was a sheet of reinforced glass, offering a breathtaking, vertiginous view of the city's ordered spires. The other walls were bare, the color of polished bone. A single, large desk of black metal and glass sat in the center, its surface empty, save for a sleek, integrated interface. It was a room designed to assert dominance, to make anyone who entered feel small and insignificant. It worked. The door slid shut behind them, the sound unnervingly final. The ambient hum of the archive was gone, replaced by a profound, oppressive silence. They were alone. The air in the room was even more sterile than in the archive, which only made Elian's scent feel more potent, more profane. "Sit," Director Thorne commanded, gesturing to a single, hard-backed chair positioned before the desk. He did not sit himself, but moved to stand before the great window, his back to Elian, his hands clasped behind him. A calculated power move. Elian sat, his spine ramrod straight, his hands clenched into fists in his lap to stop them from shaking. He stared at the director's silhouette, a dark, imposing shape against the bright, indifferent sky. He was trapped, a specimen in a jar. He waited. The director was in no hurry. He seemed to be observing the city, but Elian knew the focus of his attention was entirely on him. He could feel it like a physical touch, cold probe searching for weaknesses. Finally, Valerius spoke, his voice calm, almost conversational, which was more terrifying than any shout. The standard issue suppressants provided by the consortium are designed with a 99.9% efficacy rate. The failure of such a device is a statistical improbability. For it to fail so catastrophically suggests either a fundamental flaw in the technology or a unique biological incompatibility. He turned from the window, his grey eyes pinning Elian in place. "Which is it, archivist?" Elian's throat was tight. He could not speak. The question was a trap. To admit his biology was incompatible was to admit he was an anomaly. To blame the technology was to question the perfection of the consortium's systems. Both were punishable offenses. Seeing his hesitation, Valerius moved towards the desk, his movements fluid and precise. He leaned forward, bracing his hands on the cool glass surface, bringing his face closer to Elian's. The scent of ozone and metal intensified, a clean, sharp counterpoint to Elian's own earthy fragrance. It was a suffocating, dominant presence. "You have been functioning within my division for 7 years," Valerius continued, his voice a low murmur. "Your performance reviews are exemplary. You are efficient, meticulous, and invisible, the ideal employee. Yet you are a security threat of the highest possible classification, a compromised variable, a lie." The words struck Elian like physical blows. A lie. That was what he was. His entire life was a carefully constructed fiction, and the author of that fiction had just been unmasked. Tears burned at the back of his eyes, hot and shameful, but he refused to let them fall. He would not give the director that satisfaction. He would not be a weeping, pathetic Omega. He lifted his chin, meeting the director's cold gaze for the first time. "What are you going to do with me?" he asked, his voice trembling but clear. Valerius studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. A flicker of something, curiosity, calculation, moved in the depths of his grey eyes. He straightened up, moving around the desk to a section of the wall that slid open silently at his touch, revealing a recessed medical supply unit. His hand moved with unerring precision, selecting a small, sterile, sealed case. He placed it on the desk between them. It was sleek and silver, marked with a code Elian did not recognize. "The consortium's solution is inefficient," Valerius said, his tone clinical. "Reconditioning is a waste of resources, and decommissioning is a waste of a functional asset. You are a functional asset, archivist, at least for now." He nudged the case forward with one long finger. "This is a prototype, a targeted bioregulator, far more advanced than your standard issue patch. It does not just mask the biological markers, it actively suppresses the hormonal cascade at a genetic level. It is untraceable. No one will all know. You will continue your work. You will report directly to me. You will be my project." Elian stared at the case. It was a lifeline. It was a leash. He was not being sent to compliance. He was being saved. He was being imprisoned. The director was not destroying him. He was claiming him. The room felt airless, the silence pressing in. He was an asset. He was an experiment. He was a project. He was not a person. He was a thing to be controlled, contained, and studied by the cold, calculating man who now held his life in his hands. A bitter, ironic laugh threatened to bubble up from his chest, but he choked it down. He had traded one cage for another, smaller, more terrifying one. Slowly, his hand shaking, he reached out and took the case. The cool metal felt like a manacle against his skin. Valerius watched the Omega, Elian, take the case. The archivist's fingers trembled, the skin of his knuckles white. The scent of fear in the room had lessened, replaced by a complex mix of shock, resignation, and a faint, sharp note of defiance that Valerius found unexpectedly intriguing. The decision to handle the situation this way was, by all rational metrics, a catastrophic lapse in judgment. He had subverted consortium protocol. He had concealed a Class 1 biological threat. He had, in effect, made himself an accomplice. Any one of these actions was grounds for his own summary dismissal and review by the Central Committee. And yet, he felt no regret, only a cold, thrilling sense of purpose. For the first time in years, a new variable had been introduced into his perfectly controlled world. And it was not a problem to be solved, but a system to be reverse-engineered. The Omega's scent was a puzzle. It defied the sterile logic of his environment and his own reaction to it. That was the most fascinating anomaly of all. The low, primal hum in his chest had not subsided. It was a constant, a subsonic vibration that reminded him of the crude, powerful machinery of his own biology, machinery he had long since mastered and silenced. Or so he had thought. Now, it was awake. It watched the Omega with a predatory focus that his conscious mind could only barely contain. It recognized the paleness of the man's skin, the fragile line of his throat, the scent of his distress, and it labeled them with a single archaic word: mine. Valerius suppressed the thought with practiced ease, filing it away for later analysis. He was in control. This was not about possession. This was about containment. It was about scientific inquiry. He would study the Omega's physiology, the cause of the suppressant failure, the nature of his unmasked biological signals. He would use Elian as a living laboratory to perfect the new bioregulator, a project his family's corporation had been developing in secret for years, a true solution to the Omega problem that the consortium's crude patches only masked. This was for the greater good, for the perfection of the system. The justification was clean, logical. It almost felt true. You will be assigned to the Legacy Data Restoration Project, Valerius stated, his voice pulling him back to the cold reality of his office. It's a solo assignment. You will be given a dedicated terminal in the sub-archives. Your access clearance will be restricted to that project alone. You will report your progress to me, and only to me, at the end of each cycle. He was isolating him, cutting him off from the rest of the staff, from any possibility of accidental discovery, protecting his investment, protecting his experiment. Elian nodded, his eyes still fixed on the silver case in his hand. He didn't speak. He seemed to be retreating into himself, building new walls to replace the ones that had just been shattered. Valerius felt a flicker of impatience. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to see the data. The regulator, he said, his tone sharp, is to be applied immediately. Your current device has clearly malfunctioned. It is a contaminant. The word, contaminant, hung in the air between them. Elian flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but Valerius saw it. He saw the flash of pain and shame in the man's dark eyes before they were hidden again behind a curtain of lashes. Elian stood, his movements stiff. "Where?" he asked, his voice low. Valerius gestured to a seamless panel in the wall. "My private washroom. Be efficient." The command was dismissive, an assertion of his authority. He turned his back on the archivist again, returning to the window, feigning disinterest. He watched Elian's faint reflection in the glass as the man crossed the room and the panel slid shut behind him. Alone again, Valerius allowed a slow, controlled breath to escape his lips. The lingering scent of the Omega was fainter now, but it still clung to the air, a ghost of wildness in his sterile sanctuary. He accessed his private interface, his fingers moving swiftly, calling up Elian's file. Beta, grade C, a fiction. He created a new file, encrypted with his personal command codes, accessible to no one. Designation, Project Chimera. Subject, Unit 734. He began to input his initial observations, his language cold and clinical. Subject exhibits extreme biological potency despite long-term suppression. Scent profile is complex, with primary notes of petrichor and unidentified herbaceous compounds. Subject displays high levels of anxiety and fear-based responses consistent with a history of trauma. He paused. A history of trauma. He pulled up Elian's deeper records, files sealed even from most administrative personnel. Born in a peripheral zone, orphaned, admitted to a state reconditioning center at age 12 after a spontaneous biological manifestation. He spent 4 years there before being released, redesignated as a beta, and integrated into the general workforce, the reconditioning centers. Valerius knew of them, of course. They were a necessary, if unpleasant, part of the consortium's social hygiene program, crude but effective at enforcing conformity. He looked at the dates, the cold, bureaucratic language describing the treatment protocols. A new data point entered his calculations. The fear he had centered on Elian was not just of the present danger, but of the past. The panel to the washroom hissed open. Elian stepped out, his face pale, his uniform perfectly straightened. The air had changed. The wild, earthy scent was gone, scrubbed away by the new device. The only thing Valerius could smell now was the faint, clean scent of the soap from his washroom and the lingering ozone of his own presence. The anomaly was contained. Elian stood before him, a ghost of his former self, the emptiness back in his eyes. He looked just like he had this morning, a perfect cog, efficient, invisible. Valerius felt a strange, illogical pang of disappointment. The vibrant, chaotic variable had been neutralized. He had gotten what he wanted. He had restored order. So why did his instincts scream that he had just made a profound, strategic error? The sub-archives were a tomb, a cold, silent place buried deep in the foundations of the consortium tower, far below the hum and flow of the main data hub. The air was stale and colder than elsewhere, heavy with the dust of forgotten information. The lighting was minimal, casting long, distorted shadows from the towering shelves of obsolete physical media and dormant server racks. This was Elian's new world. A single, isolated terminal had been activated for him in a small alcove, its pale light a lonely beacon in the gloom. This was his cage, a gilded one, perhaps, compared to the reconditioning center he had been expecting, but a cage nonetheless. The new bioregulator was a cold, constant pressure against his skin. It was more potent than the old patches, its effects more profound. It didn't just mask his scent, it felt like it was actively hollowing him out, carving away at the very roots of his biology. The phantom aches were gone, but so was everything else. He felt nothing, a perfect, silent void. He was a ghost haunting a graveyard of dead data. His work on the legacy data restoration project was monotonous and isolating. He spent his days sifting through corrupted files from centuries past, piecing together fragments of a world before the consortium's great unification, a world of chaotic, emotional, illogical humanity. He read fragmented poems about love, decoded frantic journal entries about rebellion, saw pixelated images of faces twisted in laughter and grief. It was an archive of everything the consortium had worked to eliminate, everything they had tried to eliminate in him. Each day ended the same way, the soft chime of his terminal signaling the end of his work cycle, the long, silent elevator ride back to the sterile upper levels, and the mandatory report in Director Thorne's office. He would stand before the vast desk, the city lights a glittering, indifferent tapestry behind the director, and he would deliver his progress report in a clipped, neutral tone. Legacy File 3B7 restored. Content identified as pre-unification theatrical scripts. No actionable intelligence. Director Thorne would listen, his grey eyes watching Elian with that same unnerving, analytical intensity. He never commented on the work itself. His questions were always about the regulator. Report any physiological anomalies? None, Director. Emotional fluctuations? None, Director. Scent perception? Neutral, Director. Lies. All lies. Because there were anomalies. He didn't mention the way his hands sometimes trembled for no reason. He didn't mention the strange, vivid dreams he was having, dreams filled with the scent of rain and the feeling of running through a wild, open field. And he certainly didn't mention the most disturbing anomaly of all, his reaction to the director himself. In that sterile office, with the Alpha's cold, dominant presence filling the space, something deep inside Elian, something the regulator couldn't seem to touch, would stir. His senses would sharpen. He became acutely aware of the subtle shifts in the director's scent, the faint warmth he radiated, the almost imperceptible sound of his breathing. His own body would betray him with a faint, deep thrum of awareness, a primal recognition that was equal parts terror and a terrifying, shameful pull. He hated it. He hated the director for inspiring it, and he hated his own body for feeling it. He was a project, an experiment, and his captor was the only human contact he had. One evening, as he delivered his report, a wave of dizziness, a remnant of the day his world had fallen apart, washed over him. He swayed on his feet, his vision tunneling for a second. He gripped the edge of the desk to steady himself, his knuckles turning white against the black glass. Archivist, Director Thorne's voice was sharp, cutting through the haze. Before Elian could answer, the director was out of his chair and around the desk, his movements impossibly fast. He gripped Elian's arm, his fingers strong and warm against the thin fabric of the uniform. The contact was electric. A jolt of pure energy shot up Elian's arm, straight to his core. It was the first time anyone had touched him with anything other than clinical detachment in years. His breath hitched. He could smell the director's scent up close now, the ozone and clean metal. But underneath it, for the first time, he detected something else, something warmer, more personal, something that smelled faintly of spice and clean linen. It was human. The realization was so shocking, it cleared his head instantly. He pulled his arm away, as if burned, stumbling back a step. "I'm fine, Director," he said, his voice strained. "Just fatigue." Valerius did not move back. He stood close, too close, his expression unreadable, but his eyes intense, searching. "Your biometrics spiked," he stated. "Heart, rate, adrenaline, cortisol levels. That was not fatigue." He was reading him like a data stream. Elian felt a surge of frustrated anger. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, the words torn from him, raw and desperate. "What is the point of this observation?" For the first time since this ordeal began, Valerius Thorne looked uncertain. The perfect mask of cold control slipped for just a fraction of a second. A conflict played out in his eyes. "I am ensuring the stability of my asset," he said, but the words lacked their usual clinical conviction. "The regulator is experimental. I must monitor its effects." "And what if I am not stable?" Elian shot back, emboldened by a strange, reckless despair. "What if your experiment fails? What then, Director? Back to the original protocol? Decommissioning?" The silence in the room was absolute. Valerius stared at him, and Elian stared back, his heart hammering. He had crossed a line. He had challenged his jailer. He had shown emotion, that chaotic, corrupting variable. He expected a cold reprimand, a punishment, a quiet threat. Instead, Valerius did something utterly unexpected. He reached out, not to grab him, but with a slow, deliberate motion, and his fingers brushed against Elian's cheek. The touch was light, feather soft, yet it burned like a brand. His thumb swept gently under Elian's eye. "There is data," Valerius said, his voice a low, rough whisper that was nothing like his usual measured tone. "That cannot be quantified." He drew his hand back as if he, too, had been burned. He retreated behind his desk, the mask of the cold director sliding back into place, but the air in the room was irrevocably changed. Something had broken between them. A new, dangerous variable had just been introduced into the equation. Elian was dismissed. He walked from the office on shaking legs, the phantom feeling of the director's touch still tingling on his skin. He was not just an asset. He was not just an experiment. He was something else to Director Thorne, and that, he realized with a fresh wave of terror, was infinitely more dangerous. Valerius stood at the window long after Elian had gone. The city lights below were a perfect, logical grid, a testament to the order he had dedicated his life to upholding. But inside him, there was only chaos. The archivist's challenge echoed in his mind. What if your experiment fails? The touch had been a tactical error, a severe, inexcusable breach of his own protocol. He had allowed a momentary impulse, a flicker of something he refused to name, to override his judgment. He had touched the subject. He had contaminated the experiment. He replayed the moment in his mind, analyzing it from every angle. The sudden spike in Elian's biometrics, the scent of his alarm, a faint ghost that the regulator couldn't entirely suppress. The look in the Omega's eyes, not just fear, but a raw, defiant desperation that had struck an unexpected chord within him. And the feel of his skin, cool, smooth, alive. The contact had sent a jolt through his own system, a feedback loop of sensory data that had momentarily short-circuited his higher cognitive functions. It was a weakness, a flaw in his own design that Elian had, intentionally or not, exposed. His hand still tingled with the memory of it. He clenched it into a fist, the knuckles straining. He was the director. He was a thorn. His family had built their empire on the principles of logic, control, and the subjugation of inconvenient biology. His own grandfather had pioneered the first generation of suppressants, believing that the alpha-omega dynamic was a primitive relic, a source of instability that held humanity back from its true potential. Valerius had always believed in this philosophy. It was the foundation upon which he had built his life. The Omega, Elian, was supposed to be a confirmation of that philosophy. He was a living example of a biological flaw that required correction, a chaotic element that needed to be contained and neutralized for the good of the system. He was supposed to be a project, a set of data points. He was not supposed to feel like this. The primal, possessive instinct that had stirred in him on that first day had not quieted. If anything, it had grown stronger in the sterile environment of their daily reports. He had found himself looking forward to those few minutes at the end of each cycle, to the quiet tension in his office as the Omega stood before him. He studied the subtle shifts in Elian's posture, the minute flickers of emotion he tried so hard to hide. He was gathering data, he told himself, but it was a lie. He was memorizing the shape of Elian's mouth, the dark sweep of his lashes against his pale skin, the cadence of his voice. He had become obsessed. He strode to his desk and brought up the file for Project Chimera. He stared at the cold, clinical notes he had been taking. Subject exhibits signs of psychological distress despite physiological stability. Possible side effect of regulator or pre-existing condition. Pre-existing condition. The reconditioning center. He typed a new command, using his highest level clearance to slice through layers of security protocols, burrowing deep into the sealed archives of the compliance division. He found the facility's records. He found Elian's file. It was heavily redacted, but the subfiles were not. He opened a video log. The image was grainy, black and white. A small, painfully thin boy with wide, terrified eyes was being dragged by two uniformed orderlies into a stark white room. The boy was fighting, kicking, a silent scream on his face. He was Elian. Valerius watched, his face impassive, as the treatment began. Aversion therapy, sensory deprivation, chemical rebalancing. The clinical terms did nothing to mask the brutality of what he was seeing. He watched for 7 minutes, his jaw tightening until his teeth ached. He saw the boy's defiance slowly, systematically broken down. He saw the light in his eyes dim. He saw him trained to fear his own nature, to hate the scent of his own body. He closed the file. A cold, quiet rage, an emotion he had not felt in years, settled in his chest. It was not the hot, chaotic anger of a lesser alpha. It was a focused, glacial fury. The system he had sworn to uphold, the system his family had helped build, was not just inefficient. It was barbaric. It took something unique and vibrant. The memory of that wild, earthy scent flashed in his mind and brutalized it into a state of hollow conformity. They hadn't fixed a flaw. They had broken a person. And he had continued the process. His regulator, his isolation, his clinical observation. It was just a more refined, more sophisticated version of the same violation. He was no better than the white-coated technicians in that grainy video. The realization was a physical blow. He looked around his office at the sterile perfection, the cold glass and steel, and for the first time he saw it, not as a sanctuary of order, but as a prison. The same as the one he had built for Elian. He had to change course. The experiment was no longer about containment. It was no longer about perfecting a system of control. He didn't know what it was about now, but he knew, with an unnerving certainty, that its parameters had fundamentally and irrevocably shifted. He opened a secure comms channel. "Get me the full schematics and bio-interaction data for the Chimera prototype," he commanded, his voice cold and hard. "I want every scrap of research, every test result, now." He was going to understand what he had put inside Elian. He was going to find its flaws, its weaknesses. He had created the cage. He would be the one to find the key. His motivations were no longer clear, even to himself. Was it guilt, a sense of scientific responsibility? Or was it the simple, undeniable fact that he could not bear to see the last flicker of defiance in Elian's eyes be extinguished forever? He didn't have the answer. It was a variable he could not yet quantify. The days that followed the incident in the director's office settled into a new, stranger rhythm. The formal distance between them remained a carefully observed protocol, but it was now stretched taut over an undercurrent of something else, something unspoken and electric. Elian felt it in the way the director's gaze now lingered on him during their daily reports, a fraction of a second too long. He saw it in the subtle tension in Valerius's jaw, the way his fingers would sometimes still on his console as Elian spoke. The questions changed too. They were less about the regulator's direct effects and more personal. Does the archival data trigger any emotional responses? Valerius had asked one evening, his voice carefully neutral. Elian had hesitated. He had just spent the day restoring a fragmented collection of letters between two lovers separated by an interstellar war. The words were full of a desperate, aching tenderness that had left a hollow feeling in his own chest. The data is evocative of pre-unification sentimentality, he had replied, choosing the most clinical phrasing he could. It is illogical. Is it? Valerius had countered, his grey eyes searching Elian's face. Or is it simply a data set you have been conditioned to reject? The question had stunned Elian into silence. It was the first time the director had ever acknowledged, even obliquely, what had been done to him. It felt less like an interrogation and more like an opening, a crack in the wall between them. Elian started to leave small coded answers in his reports, testing the boundaries of their new dynamic. Describing a restored piece of music, he wrote, "Acoustic resonance patterns show a high probability of inducing a melancholic state." He was admitting, in the only language he knew how, that the music had made him sad. He waited for a reprimand. None came. The next day, the soft, melancholic strains of that same pre-unification music were playing, almost imperceptibly, in the background of the director's office. Elian's heart had hammered in his chest. It was a message, a confirmation. They were communicating in a language of subtext and nuance, a silent conversation unfolding in the spaces between their formal words. The isolation of the sub-archive began to feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. He found himself pouring all his focus into the work, losing himself in the ghosts of the past. He was not just restoring data, he was rediscovering a lost world of human connection, of unfiltered emotion. He was rediscovering parts of himself. One afternoon, he stumbled upon a heavily encrypted file buried deep within a military server from the Unification Wars. It wasn't part of his assigned project, but a flicker of his old archivist's curiosity, an instinct he thought long dead, compelled him to investigate. He spent hours carefully peeling back layers of antique encryption. When the file finally opened, it wasn't a military record. It was a personal log, a medical log. The author was a high-ranking consortium scientist, Dr. Aris Thorne, Valerius's grandfather. Elian read, his blood slowly turning to ice. The log detailed the early development of the suppressant technology. But it was the private, unguarded notes that made him stop breathing. Dr. Thorne wrote of his own son, a brilliant, sensitive boy who had presented as an Omega. He wrote of the family's shame, their fear. He wrote of his attempts to cure his son, to erase what the consortium deemed a genetic flaw. The experiments were brutal. The boy was subjected to hormonal therapies that ravaged his body and mind. The log ended abruptly. The final entry was cold, detached, clinical. Subject expired due to systemic hormonal shock. The experiment is a failure. A more subtle, long-term solution is required. A method of masking, not eradication. Elian felt sick. Valerius's father had been an Omega who was tortured and killed by his own father's ambition. This wasn't just a political or philosophical issue for Director Thorne. It was his family's deepest, most horrific secret. His obsession with control, his drive to perfect the suppressant technology. It was all cast in a new, tragic light. He wasn't just upholding the system. He was trying to fix what his grandfather had broken. He was trying to succeed where his grandfather had failed, to create a cure that didn't kill the patient. And Elian. Elian was his new subject, his new chance to right a generational wrong. The realization was devastating. He was not a unique variable to the director. He was a ghost, a stand-in for the uncle he'd never known. The fragile, tentative connection he thought had been growing between them was a lie, a projection of the director's own trauma. A bitter, hollow ache spread through his chest. He felt used. He felt like a fool. He stood up from his terminal, a storm of anger and grief raging inside him. He had to confront him. He had to know the truth. He didn't wait for the end of the cycle. He took the elevator straight to the top floor, his mind a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. He didn't know what he would say, what he would do. He only knew that the silent, careful dance between them was over. He stormed into the director's office without being announced, the doors sliding open to reveal Valerius standing by the window, staring out at the city. He turned, his eyes widening in surprise at Elian's unscheduled appearance. "Archivist," he began, his voice laced with caution. "Aris Thorn," Elian said, the name a weapon on his tongue. He saw the flicker of recognition, the instant comprehension in the director's eyes. The blood drained from Valerius's face, the mask of control shattered, not into pieces, but into dust. For the first time, Elian saw the man underneath, haunted, vulnerable, and utterly exposed. "His son," Elian pressed, his voice shaking with a fury he didn't know he possessed. "Your father's brother. That's what this is, isn't it? I'm just a replacement, a second chance for you to fix your family's mistake." Valerius didn't deny it. He couldn't. The truth was laid bare between them, ugly and raw. He took a step forward, his hand outstretched, his face a mask of anguish. "Elian, it started that way," he admitted, his voice rough with an emotion Elian had never heard from him before. "But it is not that way now." "Liar," Elian spat, backing away, the word tasting like poison. The emotional turmoil was too much. The regulator, designed to suppress hormonal cascades, was overwhelmed. A sharp, searing pain erupted from the device on his skin. He cried out, stumbling back, clutching at his side. The scent, his own wild, earthy scent, exploded into the room, raw and unfiltered, stronger than it had ever been before, drenched in the bitter notes of betrayal and pain. The air crackled with it. Valerius froze, his eyes widening, his pupils dilating. His alpha instincts, slammed with the sudden, potent wave of Omega distress, roared to the surface. The cool, controlled director was gone, replaced by something primal, powerful, and terrifying. The scent hit Valerius like a physical force, bypassing all his mental firewalls and striking directly at the core of his being. It was Elian's scent, but magnified, sharpened by the acute agony of his betrayal. It was the scent of a wounded animal, a cry for help that his alpha nature was genetically programmed to answer. The carefully constructed layers of his control, his logic, his entire philosophy, were incinerated in an instant. All that remained was a single, overwhelming imperative: protect, soothe, claim. He saw the pain contorting Elian's face, saw him clutch at his side where the regulator was burning his skin. The device was failing, overloaded by the emotional and hormonal spike. It was actively harming him. In 2 long strides, Valerius was across the room. He didn't think. He acted. He reached for Elian, his movements swift and sure. Elian flinched back, his eyes wide with fear and pain, misinterpreting the motion as an attack. "Don't touch me," he gasped, his voice tight with panic. The rejection was a physical blow, but Valerius pushed through it. This wasn't about control anymore. This was about preservation. "The regulator is malfunctioning," he said, his voice a low, rough growl he barely recognized as his own. "It's causing a feedback loop. I have to remove it." He cornered Elian against the cool glass of the window, giving him no room to escape. He was too close, his presence overwhelming. The mingled sense of their distress and arousal filled the space between them, a thick, intoxicating cloud. He saw the terror in Elian's eyes warring with a dawning, unwilling physical response. The Omega's body, free of suppression for the first time in years and flooded with hormones, was reacting to the proximity of a dominant alpha. Valerius ignored it, focusing on the task. He carefully, deliberately, unfastened the top of Elian's uniform, his fingers surprisingly steady. He pushed the fabric aside, revealing the pale skin and the sleek metallic device adhered to it. The skin around it was red and inflamed. He could feel the heat radiating from it. With a firm, quick motion, he peeled the regulator off. Elian cried out, a sharp intake of breath, as much from the sudden release of pressure as from the pain. He sagged against the window, his entire body trembling. The moment the device was removed, the change was instantaneous. The scent of pain lessened, but the pure, undiluted fragrance of Omega flooded the room, so potent it made Valerius's head swim. Rain and earth and something else, something warm and sweet like honey. It was the most intoxicating thing he had ever smelled. He looked at Elian. The man's face was flushed, his lips parted as he took in shuddering breaths. His eyes, dark and wide, were fixed on Valerius, no longer with fear, but with a dazed, instinctual pull. The first wave of a powerful, unscheduled heat was washing over him, triggered by the regulator's catastrophic failure. "Valerius," Elian whispered, his voice thick and hazy. It was the first time he had ever used his name. The sound of it on the Omega's tongue was a key turning in a lock deep inside him. The world had narrowed to this single point in time and space. The city lights outside the window blurred into a meaningless pattern. The only reality was the man in front of him, the scent of him, the sound of his breathing. The primal part of Valerius, the alpha he had kept chained his entire life, was in complete control now. It urged him to push the Omega against the glass, to mark him, to claim him, to answer the biological call that was screaming between them. But as he looked into Elian's dazed, vulnerable eyes, he saw something else. He saw the boy in the grainy video. He saw the years of trauma, the fear, the pain. He saw the man who had stood before him, day after day, hiding his true self behind a mask of emptiness. And the wave of pure, primal lust was tempered by another, fiercer emotion, a profound, savage protectiveness. To take him now, in this state, would be a violation. It would make him no better than his grandfather. It would make him just another monster in Elian's life. With a supreme effort of will that cost him almost everything, he reined in his instincts. He took a step back, putting a crucial few inches of space between them. The alpha in his blood howled in protest. "Breathe, Elian," he commanded, his voice strained, rougher than he intended. "Focus on me. You are in preheat. Your body is in shock." Elian just stared at him, his eyes unfocused. His scent was still pulsing into the air. a silent, desperate invitation. Valerius knew he had only moments before his own control shattered completely. He had to get them out of there. His office, his sterile sanctuary, had become the most dangerous place in the world. He grabbed Elian's arm, his touch firm, but not rough. "Come with me," he said. He pulled the man's uniform back into place, a futile gesture of restoring order in the midst of chaos. He led him, stumbling and pliant, towards a private elevator concealed in the wall, one that led directly to his personal residence in the spire above. As they moved, a new alert chimed softly on his desk console. He glanced at it. It was a red-flagged notification from Central Security. Unidentified, high-potency biological signature detected on executive level. Pheromonal density exceeds Protocol 9 parameters. Compliance Division dispatched. Estimated time of arrival, 12 minutes. Someone else had detected the scent. A rival, perhaps, or just the automated systems. It didn't matter. They were out of time. The system he had commanded for so long was now turning on him. His carefully constructed world was not just cracking, it was collapsing in on itself. He pushed Elian into the elevator, the doors hissing shut behind them, sealing them in the small, enclosed space. The scent was even more concentrated in here, a dizzying, maddening perfume. Elian leaned against the wall, his eyes fluttering shut, completely lost to the hormonal tide. Valerius stood on the opposite side, his hands braced against the cool metal, his body rigid with the effort of restraint. He was protecting Elian from the world. He was protecting Elian from himself. The irony was a bitter taste in his mouth. In his attempt to control a single, chaotic variable, he had set in motion a sequence of events that was about to bring his entire world crashing down. And as the elevator ascended, he looked at the Omega, lost in the throes of a biology he had been taught to despise. And he knew, with a certainty that transcended all logic and data, that he would burn the world to the ground before he let anyone harm him again. The doors of the private elevator opened directly into Valerius's residence. The space was an extension of his office, vast, minimalist, and cold. All polished concrete, black steel, and sprawling panes of glass that showcased the city below. But as he guided Elian out of the lift, the apartment's sterility felt different. It was no longer a symbol of order, but a vacuum, waiting to be filled. Elian was barely conscious, leaning heavily against him, his body radiating a feverish heat. The preheat was accelerating, a violent biological rebound after years of artificial suppression. Valerius's own body was a war zone. Every instinct screamed at him to take the Omega to his bed, to sate the primal hunger that was clawing at his insides. But his rational mind, battered but not yet broken, knew that compliance would be sweeping the tower. They would start with his office, and when they found it empty, his residence would be their next target. This place was not a sanctuary. It was a beautifully appointed trap. He half-carried Elian to the living area, settling him onto a low, severe-looking sofa. The Omega curled in on himself, a soft, pained sound escaping his lips. His scent, thick with distress and burgeoning need, clung to the expensive fabric, instantly claiming the space, marking it as territory. Valerius felt a fresh wave of possessiveness, a savage satisfaction at the scent of Elian filling his home. He forced the feeling down, turning his attention to the apartment's security console. "Seal all external access points," he commanded. "Activate full-spectrum signal baffling. Scramble all internal biometric sensors and report them as malfunctioning." Authorization Thorn Valerius Alpha 1. A soft chime confirmed the commands. Red lines of light traced the edges of the doors and windows as lockdown protocols engaged. He had bought them a little time, a few precious minutes, but compliance had their own overrides. They would get through eventually. He needed a plan. He looked over at Elian, who was now shivering, his face pale and slick with sweat. The heat was hitting him hard, and without proper care, it could be dangerous, even fatal, after such prolonged suppression. He needed a nest. He needed an alpha. Valerius's gaze swept the apartment. His home was devoid of anything soft, anything personal. There were no blankets, no extra pillows, nothing that could be used to construct the kind of safe, comforting space an Omega instinctively craved during a heat. It was a testament to how sterile his own life had become. He went to his bedroom, a space even more Spartan than the rest of the apartment. He stripped the single, crisp sheet and thin coverlet from his bed. He opened his closet, pulling out his spare uniforms, his off-duty sweaters, the few items of clothing he owned. He brought them all out to the living area and dropped them on the floor by the sofa. He didn't know what he was doing, only that he was acting on an instinct he didn't know he possessed. He began to arrange the items around Elian, tucking the sheet under him, draping the sweaters over him. The fabrics were all imbued with his own scent, the cold ozone and metal, but also the fainter, warmer notes of spice and linen. He was building a makeshift nest, a circle of his own scent to soothe the Omega's distress. Elian stirred, his nose twitching. He uncurled slightly, pressing his face into a black sweater, inhaling deeply. A low, almost inaudible purr rumbled in his chest. The sound vibrated through the silent apartment, a note of pure, instinctual contentment that struck Valerius with the force of a physical blow. The sight of Elian, vulnerable and beautiful, wrapped in his clothes, in his scent, broke through the last of his reservations. This was not a project. This was not a ghost from his past. This was Elian, and he was, in a way that defied all logic, his. A sharp, metallic clang echoed from the direction of the elevator. The compliance team was attempting to override his lockdown. He had minutes at most. He crossed to his main console, his mind racing, sifting through possibilities, calculating odds. Fleeing the city was impossible. All transit was controlled. Fighting was suicide. The only path was subterfuge, deception. He had to use the system against itself. His fingers flew across the holographic interface, his actions precise and rapid. He was not just the director of the archive. He had designed its core security architecture. He knew its secrets, its backdoors, its hidden flaws. He initiated a series of cascading data failures within the central server, a digital smokescreen designed to cause chaos and draw attention away from the executive levels. He fabricated sensor ghosts, phantom biological readings in a dozen different sectors, sending the compliance teams on a wild goose chase. It was a dangerous, desperate gambit. Every command he entered was an act of treason, a betrayal of the very order he had sworn to protect. He was burning his life's work to the ground to buy a few more moments. Another loud bang from the elevator door. They were using a plasma cutter. He turned back to Elian. The Omega's eyes were open, hazy, and unfocused, but they were tracking him. "Valerius," he murmured again, his voice thick with sleep and heat. "It hurts." Valerius went to him, kneeling by the sofa. He reached out, hesitated, then gently brushed the damp hair from Elian's forehead. The skin was burning hot. "I know," he said, his own voice rough with an unfamiliar tenderness. "I know. I'm going to make it stop." Elian leaned into his touch, a small, trusting gesture that made Valerius's heart ache. "Stay," Elian whispered, a plea, a command. "Don't leave." The plasma cutter sliced through the final lock. The heavy doors of the elevator began to grind open. Valerius looked from the vulnerable Omega in his nest to the armored compliance officers who were about to storm his home. There was no escape. There was only one final, desperate move to make. He leaned down, his lips close to Elian's ear. "I am not leaving," he swore, the words a vow. He pressed his lips to Elian's temple, a brief, firm gesture. It was not a kiss of passion, but of sealing a pact, an act of claiming that was also an act of shielding. Then he stood, turning to face the door, positioning his own body between Elian and the threat. He was no longer Director Thorn, the perfect instrument of the consortium. He was just an alpha, shielding his mate. The doors blasted open. A squad of black-clad compliance officers, their faces hidden behind reflective visors, stormed into the apartment, weapons raised. At their head was a woman with a face like carved granite and eyes as cold and dead as deep space. Chief Compliance Officer Mara, his greatest political rival. A zealot for whom the law was an absolute unbending weapon. She stopped, her cold eyes taking in the scene. Valerius standing defiant. The makeshift nest on the sofa. The overwhelming mingled scent of aroused alpha and an omega in full heat that saturated the air. A slow, cruel smile touched her lips. She had him. "Director Thorn," she said, her voice dripping with triumphant malice. "By the authority of the Central Committee, you are under arrest for harboring a biological deviant and for high treason against the consortium. Your experiment," she sneered, gesturing towards the nest, "is over." Chief Officer Mara's words hung in the air, cold and final. The armored officers fanned out, their weapons trained on Valerius. He remained perfectly still, a silent, formidable obstacle between them and the sofa. He had anticipated this. He had run 1,000 simulations in his mind in the few minutes he'd had. There was only one viable path left, a move so audacious, so contrary to his nature, that Mara would never see it coming. He did not raise his hands. He did not. He protest. He simply inclined his head, a gesture of seeming acquiescence. "Chief Officer," he said, his voice a calm, resonant baritone that cut through the tension. "You are mistaken. There is no experiment." Mara laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "My senses tell a different story, Director. The pheromonal readings in this room are off the charts. You've been hiding this creature for weeks. We tracked the suppressant malfunctions, the data anomalies. It all leads to you." "You are correct that the pheromonal readings are high," Valerius agreed smoothly, taking a deliberate step to his left, subtly drawing their focus further away from Elian. "But you have misinterpreted the data. This is not a case of harboring a deviant. This is a sanctioned, private matter." Mara's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. "What are you talking about, Thorn? There are no sanctions for this." Valerius allowed a small, cold smile of his own to touch his lips. He let his gaze drift towards the nest, infusing his expression with an arrogance and possessiveness that was only half feigned. "There are," he said, his voice dropping, taking on a confidential, conspiratorial tone. "When it concerns the establishment of a formal bond with a compatible mate." The silence in the room was absolute. The compliance officers shifted uncomfortably. Mara stared at him, her mind clearly struggling to process this new, impossible variable. The concept of a formal alpha-omega bond was an archaic one, a pre-consortium relic. The laws concerning it were ancient and obscure, buried under centuries of regulations that favored suppression and control, but they had never been officially repealed. "You're insane," Mara finally hissed, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "You are Director Thorne. Your family wrote the very laws that prohibit this kind of biological indulgence." "My family also understood the importance of legacy," Valerius countered, his voice like silk and steel. "The Thorne line is a foundational one. The Central Committee has long been concerned with its continuation. They granted me a special dispensation years ago, a right to seek out a compatible, high-potency Omega to secure a viable heir. The search has been discreet." He let the lie hang in the air, plausible and audacious. It preyed on the system's own prejudices, its reverence for old bloodlines, its obsession with legacy and power. He was framing his crime not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of ultimate conformity to the consortium's hidden, aristocratic power structure. "This is a lie," Mara snapped, but she was looking at him now, not at Elian. He had her attention. He had planted the seed of doubt. "Where is your proof? Where are the documents?" "Sealed. At a level far above your clearance, Chief Officer," Valerius said dismissively, waving a hand as if swatting away a fly. "But you can, of course, file a request with the Central Committee. I'm sure they will appreciate you interrupting their work to question the intimate details of my private life. It may take a few days for them to respond. In the meantime, you and your men are trespassing." He took another step forward, his alpha presence flaring, a wave of pure controlled dominance that made the lesser-ranked officers take an involuntary step back. "My mate is in a delicate condition. Your aggressive entrance has caused him significant distress. I demand that you leave. Now." Mara was caught. To arrest him now, if he was telling the truth, would be a catastrophic political blunder. It would mean making an enemy of one of the consortium's most powerful families and questioning a secret directive from the Central Committee itself. But to back down would be to admit defeat. Her face was a mask of fury and indecision. Elian chose that moment to make a soft, distressed sound from the nest. It was a perfectly timed interruption. Every head turned. He had pushed himself up slightly, his eyes hazy with heat, fixed on Valerius. His scent, which had been muted by fear, now bloomed again, thick with need and a clear, instinctual call for his alpha. "Valerius," he whispered, the sound full of a desperate, aching longing. The single word was more convincing than any document. It was a raw, biological truth that resonated in the room. The bond was real, whether it was sanctioned or not. Mara's face hardened. She had lost. For now. "This is not over, Thorne," she snarled, her voice low and venomous. She turned to her squad. "Withdraw, but secure the floor. No one enters or leaves this level until I get confirmation from the committee." She gave Valerius one last look of pure hatred before turning on her heel and marching out, her officers following in disciplined silence. The elevator doors ground shut, plunging the apartment back into a thick, charged silence. The immediate threat was gone, but Valerius knew he had not won. He had merely started a different, more dangerous game. He had publicly, irrevocably claimed Elian. He had tied their fates together, He had declared him his mate to the most dangerous woman in the consortium. He turned back to the sofa. Elian was watching him, his expression a mixture of confusion, awe, and a deep, soul-shaking vulnerability. The lie he had told to save them now had to become the truth. He crossed the room and knelt again before the nest, before Elian. He gently took the Omega's hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. The fevered skin was soft, pliant. "Elian," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of all artifice and authority. "Forgive me. I had no other choice." Elian stared at him, his mind clearly struggling to clear the fog of his heat. You said, a bond," he murmured. "Mate?" "It was a lie to save us," Valerius confirmed, his gaze unflinching. But he paused, the next words feeling more honest than anything he had ever said. "It does not have to be." He saw the conflict in Elian's eyes, the fear and the hope. He had just been betrayed, and now he was being offered a new, terrifying kind of trust. The apartment was silent, a bubble of borrowed time. Outside, the forces of the consortium were regrouping, but in here, in the circle of scent and shared desperation, a new world was being forged, its laws unwritten, its future unknown. Valerius waited for his answer, knowing that whatever Elian said next would determine not just their survival, but the very nature of their souls. Elian stared into Valerius's winter-grey eyes and saw a universe of complexities he had never imagined. The cold, calculating director was gone. The haunted man, grappling with his family's ghosts, was there. The primal, possessive alpha was there. And now, this man who had just risked everything, his career, his legacy, his life, on a single, monumental lie for his sake. The fog of his heat was a thick, syrupy haze in his mind, pulling him toward instinct, toward the simple, overwhelming need for the alpha before him. But a part of his consciousness, the part that had survived the reconditioning center, the part that had meticulously built a life of careful control, was fighting back, screaming at him to see the trap within the sanctuary. Mate. The word was a fantasy and a terror. It meant a connection he had been taught to believe was a sickness. It meant a surrender he had fought his entire life to avoid. Yet the alpha who offered it had not taken advantage of his weakness. He had built him a nest. He had protected him. He had faced down the system they both should have feared, and he had not flinched. "Why?" Elian whispered, the single word a condensation of 1,000 questions. "Why save me? Why risk this? Why lie?" Valerius's expression softened, a subtle shift of muscles around his eyes that transformed his severe features into something else entirely, something tender. "When I saw your file," he began, his voice low, "the records from the center, I saw a system I have upheld my entire life, and I saw its cruelty. When I saw you, standing in my office, defiant even in your terror, I saw its failure. The system is flawed, Elian. It seeks to erase a part of us that it cannot control. I have spent my life believing that control was the answer. I was wrong." He squeezed Elian's hand gently. "I do not wish to control you. I wish to understand you, and if you will let me, to protect you from a world that would see you broken." The sincerity in his voice was a balm on Elian's raw nerves. The heat, which had been a source of pain and panic, seemed to soften, to transform into a deep, radiating warmth that started in his chest and spread through his limbs. The instinct to trust, to lean into this unexpected strength, was overpowering. He had been alone for so long, fighting a silent, solitary war against his own nature. The thought of having an ally, a partner, was a hope so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He had no more words. He simply tightened his grip on Valerius's hand, a small, silent gesture of assent. It was enough. Valerius understood. A look of profound relief passed over the Alpha's face. He lifted Elian's hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to his knuckles. "The heat will get stronger," Valerius said, his voice practical again, though threaded with a new warmth. "You need to rest. You need to be kept safe." He stood and moved to the apartment's main console. "Mara will not be idle. She will be tearing through the archives looking for the dispensation I mentioned. It does not exist. I have, at best, a 48-hour window before my lie is exposed." "What do we do?" Elian asked, his voice still weak. "We create it," Valerius said simply. His fingers began to move across the console, not with the frantic energy of before, but with a calm, focused intensity. "I will fabricate the documentation. I will bury it in the committee's private servers, backdate it, lock it with encryption so complex that by the time Mara's cyber analysts get through it, the data will appear to have been there for years." He was not just a master of the archive. He was a master of its manipulation. He was going to build their salvation out of lies and code. "While I work," he continued, turning back to Elian, "you need to focus on getting through this. Your body needs to complete its cycle. Let it happen. You are safe here. I will not leave your side." For the next several hours, a strange domesticity settled over the besieged apartment. Valerius worked tirelessly at the console, a silent, focused sentinel, building their digital fortress. And Elian, cocooned in the nest of the Alpha's scent, finally surrendered to the heat. It was not the terrifying, painful experience he had been conditioned to fear. Here, in this safe space, with the steady presence of a protective Alpha nearby, it was a slow, languid unfolding, a reawakening. The aches in his body eased, replaced by a deep, pulsing need. But it was a need without shame, without fear. It was just a part of him. He drifted in and out of a feverish sleep, and every time he woke, Valerius was there. Sometimes he was at the console. Sometimes he was sitting in a chair he had pulled up near the sofa, simply watching over him. Once, Elian woke from a nightmare, a fragmented memory of the center's cold tables and colder eyes, and Valerius was there instantly, a cool cloth on his forehead, his low voice murmuring reassurances until the fear subsided. He brought Elian water, his touch gentle, impersonal, yet profoundly intimate. He was caring for him, not with the possessive fire of an alpha claiming a mate, but with the steady, quiet tenderness of a partner. And in those long, fevered hours, as his body purged itself of years of suppression, and Valerius rewrote their reality one line of code at a time, the bond between them began to form. It was not a fiction created by a lie to the compliance division. It was a real, tangible thing, forged in shared danger, mutual vulnerability, and an acceptance so profound it felt like coming home. The peak of the heat came near dawn. Elian woke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The fever had broken, leaving behind a deep, resonant ache that was not painful, but full of a quiet, humming energy. He felt whole. His scent no longer felt like a liability, a secret to be hidden, but a simple, natural extension of himself. He sat up in the nest, the sweaters and sheets falling away. Across the room, Valerius was asleep in his chair, his head slumped to one side, his proud, severe face softened and made vulnerable by exhaustion. The first rays of the new day's sun cut through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, catching the silver in his hair. Elian looked at him, at the man who had torn down his own world to save him, and felt a surge of emotion so powerful it took his breath away. It was not just gratitude. It was not just the echo of a biological imperative. It was something deeper, something quieter, something he had only read about in the fragmented poems he had restored from the archive. He slipped out of the nest, his movements quiet, and crossed the room. He knelt before Valerius's chair and gently, tentatively, rested his head on the alpha's knee. Valerius stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked down at Elian, his expression hazy with sleep. Elian didn't say anything. He just looked up at him, letting him see the truth in his eyes. He was no longer a project. He was no longer a victim. He was an Omega. He was Elian, and he had, against all odds, chosen his alpha. Valerius's hand came up, his fingers gently threading into Elian's hair. A slow, genuine smile, the first Elian had ever seen, touched his lips. "Good morning, Elian," he whispered. The city outside was still a threat. The future was a terrifying unknown. But in the quiet stillness of that dawn, in that sterile apartment now filled with the mingled, harmonious sense of Alpha and Omega, they had found their beginning. It was not an ending. It was a foundation, built of secrets and code, upon which they would build a new, defiant life together.